life is chapters, and I look back now at my 20s and 30s and in my 40s and 50s, and I'm not the same person, and I change and evolve over time. I've run businesses that haven't worked. I've tried to be commissioned into the military and that didn't work. I've had a failed marriage and, all of these things. They are failures, but I'm not a failure. Dad always said, why can't Peter just do normal things? Why can't he just join the army? He has to go join the commandos. He can't just run. He has to do marathons, and he can't just ski. He's got to try and go to the Olympics. And I think that's just setting the bar high for yourself.
You are listening to the Akkeri podcast, a show about men and masculinities, the challenges that modern men face, and how to chart a better way forward. I'm your host, Matt Howlett, mental health coach and founder of the Akkeri. If you are interested in entrepreneurship, travel, or you are simply a man who sets the bar high for himself, this episode is for you. Why? Because my guest in this episode is Peter Collins, one of the most interesting people that I've had the privilege of getting to know. Peter is a serial entrepreneur, former British Army commando, and professional photographer. He has been a high-level athlete competing in marathons, ultramarathons, and nearly making the Olympics in ski racing, and he has lived and traveled all over the world. Peter's story is one of failure, never giving up, and always finding ways to pair creativity with business opportunities. I hope you enjoy and are inspired by this conversation. Peter Collins.
Matt Howlett. Hello, mate. How are you?
I'm good, man. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's been a while.
It has been a while. How long? Was it 2018 that I last saw you?
Probably.
Wild.
That's a long time. Lots of things have happened, eh?
Yeah, lots of things have happened in, I suppose, just over 6 years. You're in Portsmouth?
I am.
So that's where you're living and where the business is happening.
That's right. Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about the business. Like, what I'd love to do is pick different parts of your story, because honestly, you probably don't see yourself this way. And based on your reaction to my request to join the podcast, I'm pretty certain that I've got this right. You don't see yourself as an overly interesting person, ideal podcast guest, but you've done a lot of different things.
I have, and thank you for that.
Yeah.
I think life's taken me in lots of different directions, and I've gone with the flow on that. Yeah, I look back sometimes and I talk to other people and I think, there's a lot happened in my life. I've lived in lots of places. I've done lots of different things. I've been successful. I've been a failure. So, I suppose I don't know if I consider myself successful in many ways. I'm very hard on myself. I think that's the thing.
I am as well. Yeah.
Yeah. And I sort of look at the failures or the things that didn't work out rather than the successes.
Yeah. I think that's a typical characteristic of a man. I haven't met too many men that aren't somewhat hard on themselves. And the more I get to know some of them, they're about as hard on themselves as I am. And it sounds like you are as well. I want to jump back because there's a lot about you that I don't know. And for everybody who's listening, we met in Canmore in, I think it was 2017, 2018. You were running a co-working space. I was working on a startup, had recently moved there. So I know bits and pieces about your life, but I don't know the full story. And I think there's several parts, several chapters of your story that are going to be super interesting to other people. I want to hear more about the military experience, right? So the website, Ship to Shore, what is it, Peter, exactly? The website?
shiptoshoredesigns.co.uk.
.co.uk. Okay, so shiptoshoredesigns.co.uk is where I saw the actual title, Commando. That sounds super cool. That sounds like Rambo, right? So you're going to have to, that's not a term I've heard before. That's not a designation we have.
No, and I think it probably sounds a lot more romantic or something than it really is.
Sure.
I mean, rewind back to school, 17, 18 years old.
Okay.
I was going through basically high school here in the UK, studying English, geography and geology at A-level, and applying to university and got accepted to go to university to read geography. And then something, I did read really poorly in my exams.
Okay.
And I failed all of my A-levels, which you need to do to get into university in the UK.
Okay.
And I effectively blew them all. I'm not good at exams. I'm not good at memorization, and so that was a big blow. And so I ended up going into the military, my father had been a Grenadier Guards officer. He joined up at 16, worked his way all the way up through the ranks. I had an older brother who had also gone into the military, and I was in the part-time territorial army in London during my A-levels. And so I joined the army, and I applied for a commission. I actually applied to eventually all 5 services. I applied to the army twice. I applied to the Royal Marines, I applied to the Navy, and ultimately to the RAF. And I got rejected as an officer on all of those occasions at different times.
Oh, geez.
And I suppose I was summed up best by my army. I went to the regular commissions board to become an army officer, and I was told, my report said I had all the right qualities, but I failed to display them. And I think that should be written on my gravestone. I mean, sometimes. So I didn't get commissioned, but I went in as an aircraft technician, which was what my brother did, servicing helicopters. And I did a 1 year. I did all the basic military training, and then I did a 1 year course in aircraft engineering. And I quickly discovered that I was good at it, but it wasn't something that really motivated me. A lot of guys, young guys, grow up with motorbikes, maybe, and tinkering with cars and and I never did, and I wasn't interested in that. And so I ended up as an aircraft technician almost by default. It was the best paid job in the army, and the highest sort of qualification that you could get.
Yep.
And so my first posting out of training was to the Royal Marines down in Plymouth, and they had a brigade air squadron, the Commando Brigade Air Squadron. So I got posted to them, and as part of that, I had to go and do the All Arms Commando course, which was an 8-week course, and at the end of that, I got my Green Beret. So effectively, there's the Royal Marines, but then they have attached personnel who do a lot more specialised trades. And they are designated as either Army Commandos or Navy Commandos. Okay. So I became an Army Commando and had my Green Beret. But as part of our role was to work in Norway, and we defending that northern flank. And so we spent time in the summer on exercise, and then we did a winter deployment every year, 3-month deployment to the Arctic. And that was where I suppose I really found my calling, which was being in the, I remember going to, I grew up in southern England mainly, and I went to Norway. I got off the back of a Hercules in, central Norway in the middle of the winter, late December, and it was minus 26. And I'd never experienced anything like that.
Wow.
And I thought, I'm here for 3 months. This is going to be absolutely brutal.
Yeah.
And of course, as and living in Canada, it can change. So I ended up doing a couple of tours in Norway in the winter, and that took me into skiing and then into climbing, and it just developed a whole new world for me that I really didn't even know existed. So the Green Beret, the commando bit, yes, I was a soldier, but most of the time I was either maintaining aircraft or eventually skiing. And I became a ski racer. I became a cross-country skier, biathlete, posted to Germany, and spent the next 5 years effectively chasing the dream of being a competitive cross-country ski racer.
So how did that transition happen then? Did you leave the army, or was that part of?
That was part of I was still in the military. I was still being paid and wearing uniform. But I became successful as a cross-country ski racer.
Right.
And that opened some doors for me and allowed me to go away and train and to race, competitively on the circuit in Central Europe, which was a lovely lifestyle. Of course, but it's hard. I mean, cross-country skiing is an incredibly, tough sport, mentally and physically.
Yeah.
And I was very fortunate because, of course, I then was being paid to do that, which certainly in Canada, it's, really hard on a lot of athletes, ultimately I was able to support athletes later when I lived in Canada.
Right. So did you still have military responsibilities, or were you primarily an athlete?
No, I did. I spent probably 4 or 5 months a year away, and then or training, and then the rest of the time actually, being a serving soldier, wearing uniform, doing my job.
Right.
Yeah.
Again, in Norway or elsewhere?
In Germany.
Okay.
And I was in Northern Ireland. I did a tour in Northern Ireland during the early 80s. So I was a serving soldier as well.
What's the wildest, best memory from military time? Is there one story that sticks out, comes to mind?
Oh gosh, getting my Green Beret was a very because I had to do it twice. I did the course the first time. I got injured. I got a stress fracture in my leg, and I had to come off the course after about 5 weeks, and that was a pretty low. And then I went back after I recovered, and I did it again. And the combination of your Green Beret training is you do the 30 miler across Dartmoor in under eight hours. And Dartmoor's a very rugged terrain. You do it as a small group. And you're wearing about 30-pounder kit, carrying a rifle. You got to navigate your way, and it's and it is the culmination of every Royal Marine or every commando's training. And at the end of that, you get your Green Beret, and that was a very special moment, I suppose, getting that.
What do you think the biggest challenge was from all of that? Was it primarily a mental challenge? Because obviously, there's a lot of physical exhaustion. Especially, you mentioned that 30 miler, like that was a hike with a rucksack, gun, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of mental toughness that you have to be able to keep going, to be able to face those challenges every day, and just to get up and keep going. And your body's, basically starting to slowly fall apart and everything else. So it is hard. And I think what I learned, and I heard people talking very early on in the course, is that they talked about the 30 miler, which is the last thing you do after sort of 8 weeks. And I just took it a day at a time. It's just like, I'm going to get up today. This is what's happening. Forget yesterday, and just take each step as you go. And I think that was really important. Not being, we've got to do the 30 mile at the end of this, and that's so hard. It's just like, that's just another progression. We'll deal with that, when I get there.
Yeah.
And I think that's all of those qualities that I learned, in getting my Green Beret and going through that training. It set me up, in life to overcome the many hurdles that life throws at us, as we know.
Yeah. Have you recommended that same, I suppose, first step after school to other men specifically?
I don't know if I have. I think having lived in Canada for, 20 odd years and obviously growing up in the UK, and I was born, 14, 15 years after the end of the Second World War. And of course, everyone here, every male that you knew here who was an adult had been through the war, either, in some capacity, or, uncles and grandfathers and
right.
Everything else. And I think there's a big tradition in the military in the UK, and it's not unusual. But I found that when I moved to Canada, it was almost like you didn't talk about the fact that you'd been in the military. There was almost like this sort of, I think it was a sort of, from the States, Vietnam sort of fallout almost.
Okay.
I don't know. But I just found that I never met people who'd been in the military, or only one or two people who ever sort of had admitted to having been in the military. Whereas here, it's almost like, it's not a badge of honor, but it's almost like, yeah, I was in. Well, who were you with? And I meet people all the time here who are ex-servicemen.
Right. And is it suggested or talked about, you think, because people expect that service to country, or do they see the value in, like what you just mentioned, preparing you for life? Is it a mix of both, or more of one or the other?
I think it's a mixture of both.
Yeah.
I think, I'm not sure. I think people can look at military in two ways, and either you've sort of had your brain taken out and you've been sort of forced into this system of compliance.
Sure.
And I served with some of the most wonderful young guys who are intelligent and thoughtful, and they, not automatons or not sort of, gung ho guys in any way. And I think that's, one of the things that I certainly took from the military. And it's tough because ultimately there's a possibility that you're going to have to go to war. You're going to go and have to serve in some sort of combat zone. And we talk about the times we live in now, but the situation around the world, makes that a more of a possibility. But I think I probably came out of the military, and certainly as I've grown up and certainly as I became a father, with a more of a pacifist attitude to life. But I believe in the military, and I believe in the traditions and the history of the military, and I'm proud that I served in that capacity. But of course, war is a terrible thing, and if there's a peacekeeping role for the military and or some other way of channeling that young energy to do that, I don't know.
Right. Coming out of the military, was that basically because of the athleticism, because of the skiing? Like, did that transition just kind of happen naturally? You became more of an athlete? Did you serve your time and just finish and keep skiing?
Well, no, I mean, to be honest, I'd signed up on a 6-year contract within the military.
Okay.
You sign up with an option to leave after 6 years. You sign up for 22 years, but you have to give 12 months notice. And I actually ended up staying in, and I did almost 9 years. But to stay in, I would have had to stay into the aircraft world. And I would have had to go and done upgrading courses and done all those sorts of things on the technical side for me to continue in the role that I was in. And I just got to that time in my life. I was 27, and I thought, this is not what I want to do for the next, X number of years. And there's a whole world out there. There's a big world out there. And there are other opportunities. But it was tough. I mean, I honestly, when I left, because I was a single soldier, I was living on the camp, all my friends, my job, all, my running partners, my whole sort of world was built around the military. And when I left, I remember going up to Yorkshire to do a resettlement training, course for a month, which the army sort of prepare you for civilian life in terms of writing resumes and giving you other skills. And I remember the first day I went up there and I drove up onto the Yorkshire moors, and I sat in my car and I cried, because it was a sort of shock and sort of, what have I done? I'd sort of turned my back on everything that I'd known. And I grew up in the military. I grew up in a military family. And so I felt that I'd closed that door, and it was tough. But then, I then realized, of course, that there are other opportunities there, and I had to take them, and I had to bridge that gap into being a civilian and finding new ways to, make a living.
Right. So what did come next after that? Because I guess I'm blending the skiing and the military into one. I always thought that there was a period where you had left the military and you continued as a coach in some capacity, but
I did.
What was next?
I did. Yeah. Well, effectively, I left in 87, in the spring of 87, and I was hoping to go. Well, I continued skiing. I continued to train on my own. I lived with my parents went back to live at home for about 6 months, and I continued to train. And in the beginning of 88 was the Olympics in Canmore.
Right.
And that was a sort of goal for me to try and make that British team. And so I trained on my own, and I traveled, and lived in Germany and Switzerland and chased the snow, and I chased a dream. And I went to what was effectively the British championships, and but I broke my arm in the November. I fell roller skiing and actually broke a bone in my wrist, and that set me back. But ultimately, I wasn't good enough. I mean, and you have to accept that sometimes. Just wasn't at that world-class level to go and compete at the very, very highest level.
How did you figure? That's an important lesson, Peter. How did you figure that out? Because I think a lot of us men, we hit failure and we go probably into anger or depression or like cynicism, something, related, something in that category, we'll say. But we don't necessarily realize that, oh, maybe that thing is just not for me. I have other interests. You know what I mean? I know as a younger man, I definitely got focused on one thing or two things. And if I found that I wasn't good at them, that generally led to frustration and beating myself up, like we talked about earlier, and being hard on yourself and thinking that your potential is lower than what you had actually hoped that it was. But how did you figure that out? Because that's the mindset that you want to have, where this is just not for me. I'm not suited for this, but there's something else.
It's a good question, and I don't know if I've ever answered that myself, how I've done it. But I've done it a lot in my life, and I think it's just a case of life moves on, and life is chapters. And I look back now at my 20s and 30s and my 40s and 50s, and I'm not the same person, and I've changed and evolved over time, and I think that's an important to recognize that things don't always work out, and I think when we're younger, when we're in our teens, we just go through life and it's sort of successful, I think failing my A levels and not going to university was probably a big lesson in that.
Right.
Yeah, I was devastated when I remember getting my results and lying on my, up in my house, in London with my parents' house and just being, kind of distraught because I was on that pathway, and that was a pathway everyone put you on, go to university, get a good career, and that didn't work. And so I suppose I had to pivot at that point, and so, it's something like not making it as a ski racer. It wasn't the end of the world. It's like, I've had a good kick of the can. I've done well with that. Where can I go now? What do I do now? And if you look at something like cross-country ski racing, I was watching the biathlon world championships earlier on today. There's only ever one winner. There's 3 people are going to come away with medals, and everyone else is either going to be frustrated or angry or just go, well, I've done this. I've raced at this level. I've enjoyed it. And it's time to move on.
Yeah.
I remember thinking, what do I like? What do I really want to do?
Right.
And I was totally into photography, and I've always had a camera in my hand from I think I bought my first proper camera when I was about 18 or 19, an old Canon A1. And I remember shooting that. And I love sport and I love photography. And I set up a business called Sporting Images, going around doing sports, shooting team photos and leisure centres and sports centres and all sorts of things, and basically just learning to hustle and learning to try and build a business. And I did that, and it started to build those skills and build some clients and do all of those things. And it's hard. It's hard being a startup. And I did that for about a year, and then I saw a job advertisement come up for a new cross-country ski centre opening in Scotland, in the northeast of Scotland. And I looked at that, and I thought, that just brings together everything that I've done.
Right.
The qualifications that I've got, the experience that I've got, so I had the management experience or the entrepreneurial experience. I had the skills to teach skiing, to develop programs.
Yep.
And I applied for that. And I went up to Northeast Scotland, got shortlisted and went for an interview. And it was a 10-hour train journey to get there. And I remember coming back on the train and after the interview, and I thought, I'm going to get this job. I know it, and it's going to change my life. And I felt I'd gone to the end of the world, because it was right up in the northeast of Scotland. Yeah. And I did get it. And I ended up moving up there, literally, developing everything from the building to the tracks to everything, and a program. My then girlfriend at the time, she happened to get a job down in southeast England, so we were having this sort of remote relationship, which ultimately failed. So it did change my life,
Right.
And so I ended up building this program and building the ski center, and I loved it. I loved the whole challenge of that. And I met a Canadian who had two young children, separated, and we ended up becoming a couple. She moved in one day with two kids and a cat, I think, and we ultimately got married and had a daughter, right. and lived there in Scotland for about 9 years. And the stepkids were young, and my daughter, and they all grew up in that environment. And it was such a lovely lifestyle. It was very poorly paid, but it was just the job that I wanted to do. And we did that, and I did that up until my late 30s. Yeah. And then there was sort of changes on the horizon in terms of the overall funding of the centre, because it was a local authority that ultimately put the money into everything. And but I was a very independent manager. I worked with the management committee, and I could see that change was coming, and it was getting very difficult and quite frustrating. And so I applied for my Canadian citizenship, because just to have it. And eventually I ended up just having to quit for mental health reasons, really, because it was getting so hard. I remember just sitting in bed one night and I said to my then wife, I said, I can't do this anymore. I can't keep fighting, on this level with the changes that are happening and the demands and everything. It's just not fun anymore. And so she said, well, leave. And I remember I got up the following morning and I resigned. I wrote a letter and I resigned, and I walked away. Yeah. And that was tough. Again, it was a very tough decision to do that. And then my Canadian papers came through, and I thought it was going to be an open-ended sort of, piece of paper you could move when you wanted, but it had a time limit on it.
Oh, okay.
And I think that was in the sort of spring, probably March, April time. I got that, and I didn't have a job, and I wasn't prepared to move at that time, because it was a huge, obviously, wrench to move to Canada, to have to have nothing there, not know anyone. So we sort of batted it backwards and forwards. We should stay, we should go. And then we decided that if we were going to go, it had to be during the school holidays, because that was the best time for the kids to do that. Right. And I think we moved in pretty quick time. I think within about 5 weeks, we made the decision to go. And we got rid of we were renting a house, so we got rid of everything and we moved. Yeah. Moved to BC, where my ex-wife's family were from, Vancouver.
Oh, okay. I thought it was Nelson that you went to first.
We ended up in Nelson. Well, we ended up in that area, ended up in New Denver, which is
right.
In the Kootenays.
Yeah. I remember doing a bike trip through there, motorcycle, and I had to go specifically to New Denver to see where you had spent your time.
Right. Yeah. So we actually ended up doing a road trip. We bought a minivan and we drove all around the province and my ex was a teacher. And so we were looking at where she could possibly get some work. And so we drove all around the province, just looking at communities. Yeah. And we ended up in the Cusp and New Denver, and we all loved it. Mountains, lakes, lovely lifestyle, and moved there. And just on a whim, just said, well, let's plant our flag here. And we did.
See, I want to hear more about this. And the Cusp, there's a ferry in the Cusp, yes. Right? I remember that. I went through that and I did take that ferry, and that was on your recommendation. I love that little area. Nelson was a cute spot. I was only there for about a day, a little less than a day, but I feel the need to point out to you and yet again remind you, sir, that you have a very interesting story, and not simply interesting, but there have been important points where I probably even should have stopped you earlier and pointed out things that you've said that are, I don't know, for lack of a better word, profound. Like there was a moment there where you're talking about you woke up and, had a chat with your ex, you realized that this wasn't right for you anymore and you had to make a change, but you didn't have options. You know what I mean? You didn't know what was going to be next. You're talking about moving to Canada, throwing a big wrench in the plans and not coming here without anything. Like, that is hard. And I think a lot of us, I know, I'll speak for myself. As a younger man in my 20s, like when I decided to leave Newfoundland, I was married at the time, and I was in a position that I haven't been in since, I don't know, it's been over 10 years now because I used to be a pastor, and I left all of that behind, and I went to Vancouver, similar to you, and I went to study just media. It was something I was interested in. I had no idea where that was going to lead. I have never been to Vancouver before, never even visited, but like that type of thing is very hard. Like, what was going through your mind? What were you feeling at that period of time? Was it mostly excitement? Was there fear wrapped up in all of that? What was that like?
I'm sure that it was a very mixed set of emotions. I mean, Annie, my daughter, was not even 3 years old. And I had, two stepchildren who were about 8 and 12, I suppose. And so, there's a lot of responsibility there, obviously, to provide,
Yep.
But there was also, I suppose, a lot of excitement. I've been to Canada a couple of times. I've been over on extended family holidays. And so I sort of, I'd been to Vancouver. I'd been to Canmore, actually, and I, skied in a few places. And we had, family there in terms of, my ex's family, and I knew them. But yeah, I mean, it was tough in some ways. It was tough because I had family here in the UK. My dad had a massive heart attack at 54 and a triple bypass, and he was in his how old would he have been then? He would have been about 60 at the time. And I remember, saying goodbye to him, and I never saw him again. And we had that sort of unwritten contact when I looked him in the eye when I said goodbye to him, that this could be, good. It's not like, back in the olden days where you got on a wooden sail ship and you knew you were never going to see the old country again.
Right.
But I don't know. It was almost like it was a big thing to leave, and to leave what in terms of culture, in terms of family, your heritage, all those sorts of things. Yeah. And I've talked to lots of people in Canada who have done the same. They all say the hardest, thing as an immigrant is to be the first generation, obviously, because you still have those ties, you still have all of those connections. And, I used to follow the news from the UK, and I went through this period for years, looking back to the UK and sort of, and then not really being a part of the culture of Canada. And that changed over a couple of years, where I felt in this no man's land. I didn't know what was going on back in the UK. I didn't know what was going on in Canada. And I'm talking culturally, politically, everything.
Yeah.
And so I ended up in this sort of, this no man's land. And then gradually that changed. And then I would come back to the UK on holiday, and I didn't understand what was going on back here because people made references to stuff, and I have no idea what he's talking about.
Right.
And now, and after moving back after 21 years, it was a shock. It was like coming back to the UK was almost like coming back to a foreign land.
Oddly enough, I get that. I've moved around a fair bit in the last at least 10 to 15 years. And now I'm back to where I was raised, right? I mean, I'm in the capital city now of St. John's. I was born in Mount Pearl, which is the next city over, but they run right into each other. Like, it's not much of a difference. Now, St. John's folks would say that, oh, you're from the Pearl, right? There is a bit of a difference. And yeah, my wife even makes jokes about me being from the Pearl, but yeah, I get that to an extent, having lived primarily in BC, a year abroad, a couple of other places. I studied in Alberta, but coming back here, it was not as much of a shock because I had spent about 20 years here prior, but it was odd because there's several things here that are very different than, say, BC, obviously very different than Asia, but the West Coast and the East Coast, culturally, politically, even just infrastructure, is very different and often challenging in the weather. Well, I mean, the weather is definitely a challenge. I don't think I'm a fan of winter anymore, so I don't share that with you.
You never were. I remember being in Canmore.
Okay, come on. What did I say in Canmore? It was cold, but like there was no wind in Canmore. It's windy as hell here. Is
that? Yeah.
What do you remember? Come on now. Was I a complainer?
No, I remember because obviously you're a biker, and it's a challenge being a biker, obviously in the mountains.
Yeah, that broke my heart having to store that bike for so long, and I got it out as early as I did. There was still ice on the road in Canmore. It was still like hovering 0 in the mornings, So tell me more about that period of your life. So you were settled in BC for a period of time. Obviously, you went through some changes in life, but then how did you get to Canmore? How did you get to the co-working space and starting that next startup, and even like Buff to an extent?
Yeah, well, Buff came about because I moved from Scotland to Canada in the summer of '99. And that year, my ex and I were racing in the Discovery Channel Eco Challenge, which was a big, obviously multi-day adventure race. And so that was our focus. And it was brilliant living in the Kootenays because we had mountains, we had water, we had all the terrain was so similar to where we ended up racing in the December in Argentina. And so that was all our focus. But of course, we weren't really earning any money. We were just living on credit cards and save little bits of savings we had. And during that race down in Argentina, we got to know the Spanish team, and they were sponsored by Buff. And and I'd seen Buff in the past, and I tried to buy them before we raced in Canada. And so, very long story, but we came back from Argentina, and in the beginning of 2000, and I wrote to Buff in Spain, the parent company in Spain, and I just said, "Hey, I've just raced Eco Challenge, was given a Buff by your sponsored team. I love it. Can I please be your Canadian distributor? Love, Peter."
Right.
That was basically it. And I got a email back or something saying yes. And they sent me a few samples and some catalogs, and I knew absolutely nothing about distribution, about anything. And
that's great.
And I had a conversation with a guy who I'd met in the next village to where we lived, and he was a biker. And I showed him Buff, and he was like, "These are brilliant for motorbikes,
Love
and
mine.
He lent me, he lent me $3,000 on a 10% return to be paid back whenever he needed, he wanted the money back. And that allowed me to buy 300 Buffs, $10 a piece. So I bought on a whim 300 different colors, and I piled them in little piles in my basement or floor. And I built a website, and I couldn't afford, back then there was no such thing as Squarespace and all of these sort of template-based driven websites. We're talking about 2000. And I downloaded the free trial of Dreamweaver for 28 days.
Wow.
I built my website. And I should never admit to this, but I copied the HTML code from Martha Stewart's website. And I changed it. And I learned HTML coding just so that I could, and then the trial ran out, and then I was on my own. I couldn't afford however much it was. It was thousands of dollars back in that day.
I'm never going to forget that, Peter. That's amazing. You copied Martha Stewart's HTML code. That's great.
Yeah. And I just, and I taught myself to code enough. And I built a website, and I learned how to do all the back end and all of the payment processing. And back then, there was no security. I remember, I would literally download the orders every day on the online store. And I got all the credit card information, printed it all out, all the addresses. I then had to go into QuickBooks, open up QuickBooks, type in all of that information, each and every one, process the order, pick it, pack it. And that took so much time. And then I eventually, after probably a year or 2 years, somebody wrote a program that would transfer that information in all those orders straight into QuickBooks and create all of the sales receipts or invoices. And that was like game changer to me, because that saved me literally hours every day. But I built that up. I mean, and the website just took off at the time. And I was going to all shows. I was on the road. I was going to the outdoor adventure shows, the motorbike shows, 3 or 4 days at a time, going to Vancouver, Toronto, Edmonton, Vancouver, and just rotating around those shows and just dragging all the product and setting up and standing there all day, just saying, do you know what a buff is? And just, hustling. And of course, it took a lot of effort, a lot of energy, a huge amount of time. And I built that up. And I just kept reinvesting every time we made some money. The guy who loaned me the money in the first place, he wanted his money back again. So I paid him off. And I just slowly, sort of, and I find that every 12 months or 18 months, you get to a plateau where you go, I either just need to grow or it's going to stagnate. And I kept just sort of having to almost like reinvent the business. And I did that for probably 10 years. And I was running a $1 million turnover from my basement in the Kootenays. I remember my accountant at the time, because he said to me, you run I did it my taxes at the end of the year. And he said, you run a successful business. And I said, Mark, if I'm successful, why do I have holes in my shoes? And he said, that's just a cash flow problem, Peter, because, still we weren't making any money. We were still, everything was going back into it.
Sure.
But I was living enough, drawing off enough, to pay them the mortgage and to do all of those sorts of things. But there was certainly no fat, to live off.
A cash flow problem, but also related to just who you are, your character, your personality. I've never known you to be someone who flaunts around what they earn and buying expensive things just to have them. You invest in what you care about. You have good gear, like you have a good sense of style. You eat good food.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that, to me, was lifestyle. That's just about lifestyle. That's about and showing what's important. And because I remember I had this thought that when I got to be 45, I wanted to be independent, financially independent. Mm-hmm. That was just my goal. And I got to 45 and that didn't happen. I'm still so poor or sort of just living. And then I was walking one day with my daughter. We were walking down to the mailboxes in the spring, and Annie was about 8 or 9 and she was homeschooled, and I was walking down the road with her, and it was a beautiful spring day. And I was walking along and I thought, you know what? Life doesn't get much better than this. This is absolutely, everything you need. I'm independent. I'm running my own business. I've got a beautiful daughter. I've got this freedom to do what I want. And that was so important to me. And, ultimately that unraveled, of course, with a relationship.
Sure.
Stresses of all of life and lots of another story. And I ended up living in a small community, living in a house in the Kootenays, running the business on my own. And I came very close to a breakdown, and I ended up coming back to the UK for 3 months. And it was a very good friend of mine who had been a mentor to me and helped me with the business. And he ran the chain of outdoor retailer stores, Valhalla Pure. And David is a tremendous friend. And right. David just had to take over the business, like literally in a phone call. And he said, yeah, just go to the UK. We'll sort it out. And he ran it. And I that was in the June of 2010. And I came back to the UK for 3 months. And then I was like, where do I want to be? Do I want to stay in the UK? Do I want to be in Canada?
Yeah.
Do I want to be in the Kootenays? And ultimately, I just decided I want to be in Canmore. I just decided to move to Canmore. And I literally, in the September, I got on a plane and I flew back to Calgary, rented a car, drove to Canmore, found somewhere to live. And the business was being taken care of in BC in BC at the time,
right?
And I was sort of paying a member of staff to run it, and I was relying on David's sort of network and his whole warehouse and that. So he kindly managed it for me.
Yeah.
And I spent the winter in Canmore skiing and basically recovering from life on this sort of. And then I went back in probably in about February time. I went in Vernon. I went to see David in Vernon, and we sat down for breakfast. And he just looked me in the eye and he said, "It's time." And I said, "Yeah," and it's like time to come back and take it over.
Right.
And I looked at then moving either myself to Vernon or taking the business back to Canmore. And so I went back to Canmore and I found a space. And within 6 months, I had 6 people working for me. And we just grew. And I just threw myself totally into that. We ended up ultimately selling to 600 or 700 retail stores across Canada. We're in all the Fasani Group. We're in, all the major retailers across the country. Mm-hmm. And we were turning over, $4.5 million a year with a staff of 10 people running out of Canmore.
Impressive, yeah.
And it was a lovely lifestyle. And then, of course, we were successful. And the owners, of Bath in Spain then came to us and literally came and visited. The director came and visited me, and he said, "We're buying your company. We're going to buy your whole company, and we'll keep you for 2 years and employ you for 2 years and then kick you out." And I was literally devastated. And I fought for a year to keep it. Of course, it caused a lot of uncertainty amongst everybody. And ultimately, some difficulty. In the end, it got to the point where I just had to say, okay, you win. I can't fighting.
It wasn't worth the stress of it all.
The stress of it was huge.
Yeah, I remember you telling me about this in Canmore.
Yeah, I remember my daughter saying, "Dad, there's an old saying: take the money and run."
Yeah.
And I mean, it sounds like a lot of money, but I got a check for $1 million, and it's every entrepreneur's dream, isn't it? You become a millionaire, you're a startup, you build the business, you walk away with a check for $1 million, and it sounds like a lot of money. But by the time you paid the taxes and the accountants and the solicitors and all those other bills, it doesn't leave you with a lot, and I was on a 6-figure salary running Bath. And then my daughter came back to UK and went to Oxford to go to med school, and I paid fees. And I was in a very, very fortunate position. I had the money to be able to support her, through that process.
Right.
But it was hard. It was a very, very hard period in my life without any, because I loved what I did. I loved the people I worked with. I loved the fact that we were so strong in the community and we could support athletes and the wider picture. And it was, and I suppose it was what's the word? It was my family, as well. I'd lost, my actual family going through a divorce, but that was my bigger family, and I created some lovely relationships with a lot of people during that time that are very special to me, and I'm very proud that we could support athletes and who went on to Olympics and World Championships, and so I'm hugely proud of that. But ultimately, it was a big loss.
Yeah, but that's again, that sounds no different than the other stories that you've already relayed. Like, you chose to jump into something that you were passionate about, that you cared about, that was aligned with your values. A certain amount of naivete, but you went in with the right values, right? You went in with at least a solid work ethic, and you figured it out, and you created something out of basically nothing, right? And then came a point where that ended, wasn't right for you anymore, something different came up, whatever, that the case is. And on that point, I'd like to jump into the next venture a little bit and hear specifically about how that kind of came to a close as well, because COVID was the main reason for the co-working space ending. Yeah. Okay.
It was. And I found myself back in that same situation. I'd been back in it when I walked out of that job as a personnel manager back in, in my early 30s and back in Yorkshire. And I suddenly found myself at home with nothing to do. I was offered to stay for 2 years, to run Buff for 2 years, and they offered me a good 6-figure salary to do that.
Yep.
And I couldn't stay. I couldn't take that. I couldn't take that money and see what they would do to the company in terms of taking away the values and what was important to me.
Yeah, something you built and then seeing them taking that over and changing that. Yeah.
No. And I've always said, never do anything for money reasons, whether that's, because you got too much money or not enough money. And, I ran the Nordic Centre in Scotland on a very, very low salary, but I was happy to do that. And I was offered a huge amount of money to run Buff, but I couldn't take that. So I ended up basically kicking around at home. And I talked to my daughter at one time, and I'd said to her, I want to get back into photography, but it's changed. It's all changed. I used to shoot film, slides.
Yep.
And I said, all of that technology's changed, and it's now Photoshop and Lightroom and all these different things, and I don't know those. And I said, and I don't know if I'm good enough. And she looked at me and she said, Dad, go and get good enough. And that was brilliant advice for a teenager at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I did. And I went to Iceland, and I went to Dallas, and I went to Santa Fe, and I went and shot with some world-class photographers and did some workshops, and I learned, and I went back, and I realized that that's something that passionate I was about. And I did a lot of shooting for Buff, but we were shooting for ourselves. There was no commercial sort of pressure on that. And I loved it. And I shot a lot of cross-country ski racing and all sorts of other winter sports. And I absolutely loved it. And it was a real great stress reliever.
And
but I decided...
Is that what led to the co-working space then?
Yeah, because I was... one of the girls who worked for me at Buff left, Mel, she left and came... she only lasted a month at Buff, and she came to me. She called me and said, I can't work here anymore. And so she left, and she came to work for me. And we were running from home, and we were running a photography video business. Started to get clients, started to get some good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But we were running from my house, and I thought, I need somewhere to work from. I need a studio. And so I started looking around. And of course, being me, I couldn't just take on a small space. I ended up taking on 3,000 square foot of space, which we turned into a fuse box, which we turned into a co-working space.
Yeah.
And again, it was exciting building that, literally painting the walls, buying all the furniture, buying a huge investment. Probably invested well over a couple of $100,000 into the whole project in terms of time and space and everything else.
Right.
And then started attracting people and building it, and people like you came into our lives, and all, and lots of other people,
mm-hmm.
and it sort of started to create its own energy. And of course, COVID hit, and I realized right from the very start that this is not going to work.
Yeah.
And I was paying out something like $10,000 a month in rent, and plus all the other costs, insurances, and all of the other costs. And I really just sat down, and I thought, this is not going to go away in a rush. And this is in the very, very early days of COVID when it first started.
Right.
And we had to, we had to shut it down. And so I went to my solicitor and I said, can you get me out of this 5-year lease? Because and it was really hard because they weren't up for it. And eventually I ended up paying, I think, an extra month's rent, and we managed to get out of it. And then I just closed it down, and that was really hard, and then sort of sold everything off and shut the doors and just had to walk away again. And then went into basically, we went into, that was in the late spring, early summer, I suppose, of what year was that? 2020?
Yeah.
I think. So I ended up at home again in Canmore on my own during lockdown. My daughter was back in the UK going through med school. And another, long story, but we had a conversation about Christmas that year. If she came over, she had to go into 2 weeks isolation, and then she only had 2 weeks leave. And if I went the other way, all of those sorts of questions. And in the end, I went, why am I here? Why am I in Canmore?
Right.
Aesthetically, I love Canmore. I love living in the mountains, the lifestyle, all of that. I mean, it's a world-class tourist destination, and for a good reason. But emotionally, I was finding it quite tough, obviously being isolated. And, my daughter was back here, and I thought, well, she's going to be in the UK for the long run.
Yep.
And so I literally, within 7 weeks of having a conversation with her about Christmas, I'd sold my house, I'd sold my car, I'd sold most of my possessions, and I was on an aeroplane flying back to the UK thinking, yeah, I don't think it's a good move again.
Did you have a place to land at that point? Or did I miss that? Did you, like when you flew back home?
Because actually my daughter found me a place in Oxford. She found me an apartment. And so I moved back into that. So I rented a place and I lived there for about 9 months.
Right.
In Oxford. And so I got to see Annie on a regular basis, which was lovely. And then I applied to come down to Portsmouth to do a 1-year boat building course, traditional boat building.
Again, something completely new. You hadn't done that before.
No. So I moved down to Portsmouth and I started literally, from scratch. We started in joinery, learning one end of a chisel from another, learning, all the dovetail joints and everything else.
Yep.
And then moving on to small boats and then larger boats and all of the boat building. And I loved it. I loved going in the morning, standing at my bench with a piece of wood and just creating and doing something.
Yeah.
And then about 3/4 of the way through our course, they announced the college was closing. Again, a long story, but we were one of the last courses that would complete, the course.
Right.
And I tried to keep it open. I tried to take it over as an independent organization. And because, without going into the details of how it was organized and run,
sure.
But that didn't work. But as a result of that, I was offered the workshop where we had actually done our joinery workshop to take that over at the end of our course. And so I ended up taking over a 1,000 square foot workshop with access to a machine shop and starting the boat building business, starting ship to door. Took on a couple of fellow students and been doing that for the last 2.5 years, 3 years, restoration work, building boats.
And it's satisfying. It's fun.
It's
profitable.
Fun some days.
Sure. Yeah.
It's hard. I mean, I'm not getting any younger. It's full on. I work full time. I've lost, I've had staff and people move on and the hard thing is, of course, not only not having the 10,000 hours of background skill, in boat building, and I'm a perfectionist, and so it's hard to, know when to call staff and it's hard to know how to cost staff, jobs and all of that. I've been learning. It's been a massive learning experience. I've managed to try to cut my thumb off and get 23 stitches in my thumb.
No way.
Yeah.
Wild.
So, yeah, I mean, I've given blood, sweat, and tears to this.
Literally. A buddy of mine almost lost his thumb. I don't know, it was maybe 1.5 years ago. He's, I think it's construction. I think he started his own thing. I think he started primarily doing work with staircases. And just about lost his thumb entirely. It was massive surgery. I think he's got a piece of metal now in his thumb. I'm not sure.
I cut mine with one of those little craft knives. I actually severed the tendon in my thumb.
Oh, and God, Peter.
I know, but I won't send you the pictures then.
No, don't. No, we're not going to use that for the promotion of the podcast. No.
But yeah, I mean, but you know what? I think it's sort of what I see. What I do is a creative process, and I realize that even at my age, what inspires me and makes me get up, and what I look at in terms of content is creativity, and whether that's building a business, building a brand, or physically now building, or a lifestyle, or building a physical product like a wooden boat. that's what really inspires me. And I suppose that's the thread almost that's run through, through my life, I suppose.
Yeah.
Amidst all the failures and all the change and all of those other things. And even now, I've just finished a 20-foot wooden boat, built in 1946, came in for repair work, ended up being an absolute complete, once you start taking it apart, really, really bad. And it's about a 85% new build. And it looks a completely different boat to how it came in. And everyone sees it now, and I've literally just finished it in the last week or so. And people come and go, "Oh my God, it's amazing. It looks absolutely gorgeous." But I look at it and go, "Yeah, but that's not right. And that's not right." I know that. And I see these, and I'm hard on myself and I hate it, and I shouldn't do, because I do step back at it and I look at it and go, "That's pretty cool. Actually, I built that." With help, over time with different people. And I had some wonderful people help me. But for the last 4 or 5 months, I've been working on my own on it. And I do look at it and I think, the standard's really high. It's not as high as it could be, but it is.
Oh man, you're preaching to the choir. If you can, that's the thing though. If you can manage that balance between taking a step back and recognizing that what you did is pretty cool, pretty good, and other people are saying it's better than what you think it is. So you understand that you did something good, but also holding on to those high standards, not to the point where you're hard on yourself, but where you expect, your work to be good. If you can manage that balance, right? And that definitely sounds like it's been a thread. You've probably become better at being less hard on yourself over the years. But if you can manage that balance, that's the sweet spot.
Yes. I'll tell you a very small story. When I was starting in boat building, one of the things you do is build a toolbox. You build a big wooden tool chest. And it's one of the big projects you make, and it's got lots of dovetail joints in it, and you spend weeks and weeks, probably a couple of months building a box. And I had built my box, and I was very proud of it. And I actually had it on the floor, and I was sanding it down prior to finishing it, to oiling it, and it was literally done, and I finished it all off, and I went to pick it up. And as I lifted it, and it's a big box, probably, a couple of feet long and weighs, quite a lot of weight behind it. And because I'd been using sandpaper, I'd got lots of, sawdust on my hands. And as I went to pick the box up, I dropped it, and I dropped it from about waist height, and it bounced onto the corner and sprung some of the bit off at the bottom. And it made this huge noise in the workshop, and there was just this silence. And then I went, so I picked it up, and I went and found one of the instructors, and I said, "James, what do I do? How do I fix this bit here?" And I remember other people on the course were saying, I can't believe you did that," because I would have stormed out. I would have shouted and screamed and sworn, or gone sat in the corner and cried and all of that. And I was just like, but I just thought, that's done. That's in the past. I've done it. I've numpty, I've made a mistake. What do I need to do to fix it? And I suppose that's just something that's just in my nature. It's like, we have those mistakes, failures, cut my thumb. It's like, okay, how do I deal with this? What do I do now? No good regretting things, or I wouldn't sleep at night if I thought about the regrets.
Yeah, well, you wouldn't sleep at night, but you also wouldn't be where you are now. I mean, you wouldn't have started the next business and the next one and the next one.
Yeah. And I think we could probably have this conversation again in 25 years' time, and you're going to go, wow.
Yeah, well, I hope Ship to Shore doesn't end anytime soon, and there's big change coming.
I don't know. I mean, I'm at a crossroads, to be honest, again.
Really?
Yeah. You know what? I think and a lot of people, entrepreneurs, talk about this, about being starters and not finishers.
Sure.
And I love, as I say, it's that creativity side. And I think I love building the brand and building the business and setting things up. But then I start getting like itchy feet and going, wow, what's over the horizon? What's next?
I get that. Yeah, once processes are in place and you've had some success and what you envisioned is realized, you can get a little bored with it. At least I have experienced what I think is similar. Yeah.
I remember one of the girls at Buck saying to me after I'd sold the business, she said, "Peter, your heart's not been in this for years. because I've done it. I've made it successful. And that was, I remember sort of thinking about when I moved to Camel and thinking about setting up the business and thinking, what do I want Green Extreme, the company, to be and for Buff to be? And then, years later, I sort of reflected and I thought, yeah, I've done that. We've got where I wanted to be with it. I was proud of that. But it was, but then you also get to that point where, kind of bored now, need something else.
Well, I'll check back with you in 25 years. We'll do another episode.
Hopefully I'll still be around.
See if the medium of podcasts even exists in 25 years. Well, Peter, I appreciate your time. I'm not going to use all of this. I don't heavily.
You probably condense it down to about 10 minutes or something.
Absolutely not. No, this is going to be one of the longer episodes that I've had. But like I said, Peter, like I knew you'd be a fantastic guest, and as soon as we started talking, I knew a bit of your story. But, that's a very interesting story. And a lot of the guys that I know that listen to this, they're going to find this very interesting or fun, inspiring. Just the simple fact that you continued to put yourself out there, and do work that was at least just interesting. You didn't have things lined up, all your ducks weren't in a row, but you figured it out, and it's pretty much worked every single time. You know what I mean? Yeah,
I'm not sure if it's just luck or just graft, or I think you make your own luck, don't you?
To an extent.
And you look back and you think, some things just happened and we're lucky, or you saw an opportunity, and about, making mistakes, but then having to fix them and knowing how to fix them as you go. I remember friend David, who ran Valhalla Pure, a very successful entrepreneur, and he said, I've made lots and lots of mistakes in my life, but I know how to fix them. And I think I'd sort of taken that. And there's never right decisions. You make a decision and then you live with it. And that's sort of what I've always done.
Yeah.
I can look back and think, if only I'd done that, or had that opportunity, or we wouldn't be having this conversation, at the end of the day now, because my life would have gone in, if I had never opened Fusebox because if I'd done something else, if I'd been an army officer, or I'd gone and read geography and become an urban planner somewhere or something like that, isn't it weird how life, leads you in that way?
Yeah.
Our lives touched purely because, Buff, I had to go through that thing with Buff, and I had to move into something else and open Fusebox and how that all developed.
Yeah.
And you walk in one day and you go, how cool is that? I mean, how cool is all of those serendipitous moments in our lives?
Yeah.
That happen.
Yeah. And I grew up, very sheltered, closed-minded, just simply because I didn't have outside influence. I grew up on an island, obviously Newfoundland, but then within the church community and the Pentecostal church very specifically, right? So it's a very small, I would say mostly closed-minded community, because, you're looking at things through that religious lens where it's like some things are right, some things are wrong, and what you need, you already have. You're taught to be content with what you have. I didn't have people around me who traveled. I didn't have people around me who talked about, anything other than what I was already experiencing. So until I decided to even go and study theology, because at least that got me out of the island, right? So I met people who had come from different places and different backgrounds and whatever. But it wasn't until I moved to Vancouver properly, right, when I was 28, that I really, opened my mind up a little bit, and was forced to, because the first memory that I have of thinking like, wow, this is not Newfoundland anymore, it's different. I was in a Costco in Burnaby, and I could hear everybody around me talking, but nobody was speaking English. It was Mandarin, it was Cantonese, it was German, it was Russian. It was like, where am I? This is awesome, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
isn't that cool?
Yeah, I'm glad our paths crossed, man. You're someone I hope to know for an extended period of time.
I hope it's not another 4 years or 5 years or something, man.
All right, man. I appreciate it.
You take it easy, eh?
Yeah, take care, Peter.
See you. Bye. Cheers.
Thank you for listening. I hope you found some value in this episode. If you have, be sure to share the Akkeri podcast with a friend and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can find the Akkeri on socials at the Akkeri and on the web at theakkeri.com.